I was standing in the doorway of our nursery at 3 in the morning, holding an official state document that had my mother-in-law's handwritten signature where my name was supposed to be. My hands were literally shaking. My 3-week-old baby girl was fast asleep in her crib, completely oblivious to the fact that her grandmother had just tried to erase me from her life. I looked at my husband lying in our bed, snoring like nothing was wrong. And in that exact second, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my baby's name. I was fighting for my sanity. I knew right then that if I stayed in that house until sunrise, they would convince me I was the crazy one. If you're new here, subscribe. I post a new story every day. And trust me, you are going to want to stick around for this one. Okay, so, let me take a step back and give you the background here, because this didn't just happen out of nowhere. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. I'm talking red flags big enough to cover a football field. My mother-in-law, let's call her Brenda, has always had this bizarre, intense boundary issue when it came to my husband, Mark. She treated him less like a grown son, and more like a husband who belonged exclusively to her. When Mark and I got married, Brenda literally wore an off-white, floor-length lace dress. Yeah, that kind of mother-in-law. So when I got pregnant with our first child, I knew things were going to get rocky. But I honestly thought, that having a baby would finally force her to respect me as a mother. Boy, was I wrong. From the second we announced the pregnancy, Brenda completely hijacked it. She bought a crib for her house before we even picked out one for our own nursery. She kept referring to the baby as, our little girl, and no, she didn't mean Mark and me. She meant her and Mark. Now here's where I'd have lost it. We had picked out a name months in advance. A beautiful, simple name, Maya. It was my late grandmother's name, and Mark agreed he loved it. Brenda, however, hated it. She told us to our faces, that's a silly name. She's going to be named Beatrice, after my mother. I told her firmly, Brenda, we appreciate your input, but her name is Maya. She just smiled this cold, little smile and said, we'll see. Wait, read that part again in your head. We'll see. If a mother-in-law says, we'll see, about your own child's name, you pack up and leave right then. Seriously, would you have tolerated that? Let me know in the comments below, because I felt like I was losing my mind. Fast forward to the hospital. I had a horrific 26-hour labor. It ended in an emergency C-section, and I was completely wiped out. Delirious, heavily medicated, barely conscious. While I was recovering in the hospital room, the registrar brought in the paperwork for the birth certificate. I filled out my part, Mark filled out his, and we wrote Maya in big capital letters. Or at least, I thought we did. When we got home from the hospital, Brenda was waiting at our house. She claimed she was there to help. In reality, she took over completely. She moved into our guest room without asking, pushed me aside every time the baby cried, and kept making passive-aggressive comments about how I wasn't producing enough milk. I was drowning in postpartum exhaustion. And Mark was entirely useless. Every time I begged him to set boundaries with his mom, he'd just say, she's just excited, honey. She's trying to help. Give her a break. Then came the night everything blew up. It was week 3. The official copy of the birth certificate arrived in the mail. I didn't even open it right away because I was so exhausted, so I left the envelope on the kitchen counter. That evening, Brenda insisted on making dinner. She gave me a hot cup of tea, which, looking back, had a suspiciously strong herbal smell, and told me to go get a long night's sleep. I was so beat that I actually slept for 6 hours straight. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. needing a glass of water. I walked down the dark hallway into the kitchen, and the mail envelope was sitting open on the table. I picked up the official birth certificate document. I read it once. I read it twice. I had to rub my eyes because I thought the medication was making me hallucinate. The baby's name on the legal state document wasn't Maya. It was Beatrice Brenda, and listed under the secondary contact and emergency guardian details. Brenda had whited out my signature on the state copy duplicate request, written her own name in, and submitted an amendment form that she had somehow forged while we were leaving the hospital. I'm standing there in the middle of the night, staring at a piece of paper where my mother-in-law had literally swapped my child's name and tried to write herself in as her mother figure on official records. I stood in that dark kitchen, feeling this cold, heavy pit form in my stomach. I realized Mark must have known, or at least, he stood by and let it happen while I was knocked out from the C-section. Was I overreacting, or was this actual criminal insanity? How do you even begin to process a betrayal like that from the people who are supposed to protect you? I walked straight into our bedroom. I threw the birth certificate onto Mark's chest. He stirred, blinked up at me, and muttered, "What's going on?" I said, "Look at her name." Mark looked at the paper, cleared his throat, and didn't even look me in the eye. He literally said, "Look, my mom felt really strongly about it. Beatrice is a family tradition. We can just call her Maya as a nickname, right? It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. I'll be honest, I didn't expect what came next. Or maybe deep down, I did. In that split second, the haze of my C-section recovery, the exhaustion, the postpartum anxiety, it all just vanished. It was replaced by pure, blinding clarity. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just quietly turned around, walked into the nursery, and pulled out 2 big suitcases from the closet. It was 3 a.m. I packed every single piece of clothes my baby owned. I packed her formula, her diapers, her swaddles. Then I walked into our bedroom, packed my own clothes, my passport, my laptop, and every single legal document I could find in our safe. Mark sat up in bed, finally realizing I wasn't just throwing a tantrum. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice starting to panic. "Where are you going?" I looked him dead in the face and said, "I am leaving. And if your mother steps out of her guest room right now, I am calling the police and pressing charges for forgery and identity fraud." Brenda must have been listening at the door, because the second I said, "Police," her bedroom door flew open. She came out screeching, "You can't take my grandbaby out of this house. That child belongs to this family." I didn't even reply to her. I strapped my daughter into her infant car seat, grabbed my bags, walked out the front door into the freezing 3:15 a.m. air, threw everything into my trunk, and drove straight to my parents' house 2 hours away. The fallout was immediate and insane. By 6 a.m., my phone was blowing up with texts from Mark, Brenda, and Mark's siblings, calling me unhinged, crazy, and malicious for stealing the baby in the middle of the night. But I didn't waste a single second arguing with them. First thing Monday morning, I met with a family law attorney. We filed 2 things immediately: an emergency court order for full temporary custody, and a legal petition to correct the fraudulent birth certificate using the original hospital intake logs, which clearly showed my signature and our original chosen name. When the judge saw the altered documents and the hospital records, he was absolutely appalled. The birth certificate was legally rectified back to Maya. And because Brenda had physically signed an altered state document, my lawyer made it very clear to Mark that if his mother ever stepped foot near me or my daughter again, we would pursue criminal charges for fraud without hesitation. Mark tried to beg for forgiveness. He sent flowers, he called weeping, saying he was caught in the middle. But there was no middle. He chose his mother over his wife and newborn child. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Looking at this whole mess now, it's scary how far some people will go to control a life that isn't theirs. When someone shows you they don't respect your boundaries, believe them the first time, before they try to write you out of your own life story. What would you have done if you found that paper at 3 a.m.? Would you have left right then, or confronted them right away? Drop your verdict down in the comments. I read as many as I can. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for daily stories, and I'll see you tomorrow. Now, if you thought serving the divorce papers and getting Maya's birth certificate legally corrected was the end of this nightmare, I wish I could tell you it was. Because 3 days after Mark got those papers, the real campaign to ruin my life actually began. I was staying at my parents' house out in the suburbs. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Maya was sleeping soundly in her crib, and for the first time in a month, I felt like I could finally take a deep breath. And then, there was a loud, aggressive knock at the front door. My dad went to answer it, and I followed right behind him. Standing on our porch wasn't just Mark. It was Mark, Brenda, and 2 local police officers. I am not even kidding you. Brenda was standing behind the officers, holding a handkerchief to her face, doing this fake, theatrical sobbing act. The officer looked at my dad, then looked at me, and said, "Ma'am, we received a call reporting a parental abduction and a wellness check for a 3-week-old infant." I stood there on that porch, staring at Mark. I said, "Mark, are you serious right now? You brought the police to my parents' home." Mark didn't say a word. He just stared at the floor, looking completely spineless, while Brenda stepped up behind the officer and shouted, "She took my granddaughter in the middle of the night. She's mentally unstable. She's suffering from postpartum psychosis and she isn't safe. Wait, let that sink in for a second. She forged my baby's birth certificate, tried to rewrite herself as the mother, and when I caught her and left, she called the police to claim I had postpartum psychosis. Now here's where I lost my absolute mind. I looked the officer dead in the eye, walked inside, and grabbed a folder off the kitchen counter. It was the folder my family lawyer had prepared just 2 days earlier. I handed the police officer the certified court order giving me temporary full custody, the emergency injunction against Brenda, and the documented proof of the birth certificate forgery. The police officer took the papers, read through them line by line, and his whole demeanor changed. He turned around, looked at Brenda, and asked, "Ma'am, did you know there was an open emergency custody order filed yesterday?" Brenda's fake crying stopped instantly. I mean, faster than a light switch. She stammered, well, we didn't receive official notice yet." She stole the child. The officer literally sighed, closed his notepad, and said, "Ma'am, this is a civil custody matter with an active court order. The child is with her legal mother. If you do not leave this property immediately, I will arrest you for trespassing and filing a false police report." I wish you could have seen the look on Brenda's face. Her jaw literally dropped. She turned to Mark and hit him on the arm, screaming, "Do something, Mark. Tell them." And Mark just stood there, looking like a teenager who got caught sneaking out past curfew. He stammered, "Mom, let's just go. We'll let the lawyer handle it." They walked back to their car, but as Brenda got into the passenger seat, she turned around and glared at me. She mouthed the words, "This isn't over." Asterisk. And honestly, she was right. It wasn't over. Because 2 days later, Child Protective Services showed up at my door. Yep. Brenda had filed an anonymous hotline report claiming I was abusing alcohol, neglecting the baby, and living in squalor. I'll be honest, I didn't expect them to go that low. I mean, I knew Brenda was obsessed, but trying to get CPS to take my baby away. That is a whole new level of evil. How would you have reacted if someone weaponized CPS against you just to get revenge? Let me know in the comments, because I was terrified. Luckily, the CPS caseworker was an absolute professional. She inspected my parents' house, checked Maya's nursery, looked at all her medical records, and interviewed both of my parents. Everything was immaculate. Within 48 hours, the case was officially closed as completely unfounded. But my lawyer wasn't about to let that slide. We took the CPS report, the false police call, and the forged birth certificate straight to our emergency custody hearing the following week. The day of the hearing was the first time I saw Mark and Brenda in a courtroom. Brenda sat next to Mark's attorney like she was the co-defendant. She actually tried to sit at the defense table next to him. The judge had to order her to move back into the gallery 3 separate times before she finally listened. When the judge called our case, my lawyer presented the whole timeline. The emergency C-section, the whiteout on the official state paperwork, the 3 a.m. getaway, the police incident at my parents' house, and the bogus CPS report. When the judge saw the copy of the altered birth certificate with Brenda's signature on it, the atmosphere in that courtroom turned ice cold. The judge looked over his glasses at Mark's lawyer and said, "Counselor, is your client claiming that his mother had legal authority to sign an official birth certificate document while the mother was recovering in the hospital?" Mark's lawyer tried to spin it. He said, "Your Honor, it was a misunderstanding driven by excitement over a first grandchild." The judge cut him off mid-sentence. A misunderstanding. Altering a state record is a federal misdemeanor, if not a felony. That is not excitement, counselor. That is fraud. The judge didn't just grant me full temporary physical and legal custody of Maya. He issued a formal restraining order against Brenda, forbidding her from coming within 500 feet of me or my daughter. And as for Mark, the judge ordered that Mark could only have supervised visits at a court-approved center, specifically noting that his mother was strictly prohibited from attending any of those visits. When the ruling was read, Brenda literally burst out screaming in the courtroom. She yelled, "You can't do this. That's my flesh and blood. She's corrupting my son." The bailiff had to physically escort Brenda out of the courtroom while she was throwing a full-blown adult meltdown. Mark sat there at the table, clutching his head in his hands. As I walked past him out of the courtroom, he reached out and grabbed my arm lightly. He whispered, "Please, can we just talk? Just you and me. No lawyers, no mom." I looked down at his hand, then looked him dead in the eye. "Mark," I said, "you had your chance to choose your family. You chose your mother's delusions instead. We have nothing left to talk about." That was 6 months ago. Since then, the divorce was officially finalized. I got full legal custody of Maya, full child support, and primary residence rights. Mark has supervised visits once a week, but half the time he doesn't even show up, probably because Brenda won't let him leave the house without her. My daughter is almost 7 months old now. She is happy, healthy, thriving, and her name is Maya, just like it was always meant to be. Looking back on that night at 3 a.m., I used to wonder if I was being too drastic by packing my bags in the dark and running. But standing up for yourself and your children isn't being drastic. It's survival. If someone is willing to rewrite your reality while you're asleep, you owe it to yourself to wake up and take control of the story. It was 8 months after the divorce was finalized, and life had finally settled into a peaceful, predictable rhythm. Maya was nearly 15 months old, running around, babbling, and keeping me on my toes. I had bought a small 2-bedroom house near my parents', started working remote full-time, and honestly felt like the worst was far behind us. Then, one Saturday afternoon, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I picked it up, expecting a delivery driver or a missed appointment call. "Hello." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Just heavy breathing. Then a woman's voice whispered, "Is this Maya's mother?" It wasn't Brenda. It was a voice I didn't recognize at all. "Yes, who is this?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "My name is Sarah," the voice said, sounding terrified. I'm Mark's new girlfriend. Well, ex-girlfriend as of an hour ago. You don't know me, but I need to tell you what they're planning, because I can't be a part of this anymore." My heart instantly dropped right into my stomach. I sat down on the couch and said, "Sarah, what are you talking about?" She took a shaky breath and explained that she had been dating Mark for about 4 months. From day one, Brenda had practically moved into Mark's apartment, orchestrating their relationship. Brenda had convinced Sarah to apply for a job at the nursery school right down the street from my house, the exact daycare Maya was scheduled to start attending the following month. Wait, let that sink in for a second. Brenda couldn't get within 500 feet of my daughter due to the restraining order, so she groomed Mark's new girlfriend to get a job at my baby's future daycare. Now here's where I'd have lost it completely. Sarah told me that Brenda's plan was for Sarah to act as the inside eyes at the daycare, taking secret photos of Maya, handing over her daily logs, and eventually helping Mark pick Maya up on days he didn't have legal visitation rights. Sarah said, "I thought Brenda was just an overbearing mom at first, but today she brought out a folder of your daily routines, your home address, and a map of the daycare layout. She told me if I helped them, she'd pay off my student loans." I packed my stuff and ran out of Mark's apartment right then. I felt a cold wave of pure fury wash over me. I thanked Sarah, told her to block both of them, and immediately called my attorney and the police department. Within 2 hours, I was sitting at the police station handing over the call log, Sarah's signed witness affidavit, and a transcript of the threat. Because Brenda was already under a strict restraining order, this wasn't just a petty family dispute anymore. This was criminal stalking and conspiracy to violate a protection order. The next morning, 2 detectives showed up at Brenda's front door with an arrest warrant. They arrested her right on her front lawn in front of all her neighbors. When Mark tried to interfere and push past the officers, he was arrested right along with her for obstruction of justice. When we went back to court 3 weeks later, the judge was done being lenient. The judge permanently revoked Mark's visitation rights altogether until he completed a full psychological evaluation and a court-mandated parental rehabilitation program. Brenda was sentenced to a year of probation, hit with massive court fines, and slapped with a permanent criminal record for stalking. When the judge asked Mark if he had anything to say for himself before sentencing, Mark stood there trembling. He looked over at me, eyes red, and choked out, "I just wanted my family back." I looked at him, completely devoid of anger, just feeling deep, cold pity. "Mark," I said quietly across the courtroom, "you never wanted a family. You just wanted an audience for your mother. It's been almost a year since that day in court. Brenda hasn't attempted to contact us since. The threat of actual jail time finally broke her illusion of control. Mark ended up moving 2 states away, completely out of the picture. Maya is thriving, healthy, and happy. She grows bigger every single day, surrounded by people who love her for who she is, not what she can do for their ego." Looking back at this entire journey, from standing in that dark kitchen at 3 a.m. holding a forged birth certificate, to sitting in a courtroom watching the law put an end to a toxic dynasty, I learned one fundamental truth. Boundaries don't ruin relationships. Toxic people ruin relationships when you dare to enforce boundaries. If someone tries to rewrite your truth, don't argue with them. Walk away, lock the door, and let the real world handle the consequences. Have you ever had to cut off someone toxic who refused to respect your boundaries? How far did you have to go to protect your peace? Leave your thoughts and verdicts in the comments below. I read as many as I can. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for daily stories, and I'll see you in the next one. 2 years after the court case wrapped up, life had reached a level of peace I didn't know was possible. Maya was nearly 3.5 years old, talking in full sentences, and the picture of a happy, secure child. I hadn't heard Mark's voice or seen Brenda's face in over 24 months. The court order was absolute, the boundary was set in stone, and as far as I was concerned, that dark chapter of my life was closed for good. Until a heavy white envelope arrived in my mailbox on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. No return address, just my full legal name typed on the front. Inside was a legal notice from an attorney's office 2 states over. Mark had filed a petition for the full restoration of his parental rights, along with a formal request for unsupervised, out-of-state summer visitation. Attached to the petition was a stack of certificates, anger management completion, individual therapy hours, and a clean drug screening. On paper, Mark had checked every single box the judge had laid out 2 years prior. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read through the documents. He was legally entitled to request a review once his court-mandated programs were complete. But as I flipped to the very last page of the packet, my blood ran cold. Under the section listed, Proposed Custody Accommodation and Support Network, Mark had listed his primary residence. He had bought a home with a separate guest suite, and listed as the primary, full-time live-in caregiver while Mark was at work. Brenda. He hadn't changed at all. He had spent 2 years jumping through legal hoops, taking classes, and passing screenings, not to rebuild a genuine relationship with his daughter, but to craft a legal backdoor to bring Brenda right back into Maya's life. Wait, read that again. He did 2 years of court-ordered therapy just to hand the baby right back to the woman who forged her birth certificate. Now here's where I lost my absolute mind. My attorney immediately filed an opposition motion, setting up a formal custody hearing before the exact same family court judge who had presided over our case 2 years ago. When the hearing date arrived, I walked into that courtroom feeling a strange mix of dread and absolute determination. Mark sat at his table, wearing a tailored suit, looking polished, reformed, and confident. Brenda wasn't in the courtroom this time. She knew better than to risk violating her permanent restraining order, but her presence hung over his entire case file like a shadow. Mark's new attorney stood up and gave a glowing presentation. He spoke about redemption, about a father who had done everything the court asked of him, and about a child's right to know her father. He presented the certificates, the psychological evaluation stating Mark was low risk, and argued that Mark deserved a fresh start. Then, the judge turned to my attorney. My lawyer didn't focus on Mark's therapy certificates. He didn't contest that Mark had completed the classes. Instead, he submitted one single exhibit to the judge, the real estate registry and sworn affidavit confirming that the home Mark purchased was co-owned by Brenda, and that she was listed as the primary live-in supervisor for Maya's proposed visitation. My lawyer said, "Your Honor, the respondent has satisfied the technical requirements of his rehabilitation." But the core threat to the child was never simply the respondent's absence, it was his active collusion with an individual who committed legal fraud, criminal stalking, and severe boundary violations against the mother. The respondent is asking this court to place a 3-year-old child directly back into the daily care of a person who holds an active, permanent restraining order regarding this family. The judge stared down at the documents for what felt like 10 minutes in total silence. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, the judge looked over at Mark. "Mr. Davis," the judge said softly, his voice heavy with authority. "Do you understand why this court placed restrictions on your custody in the first place?" Mark stood up, clearing his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. Because I failed to protect my family dynamic and allowed conflict to escalate." "No," the judge interrupted firmly. "You allowed a third party to forge legal state records, stalk your ex-wife, and attempt to dismantle the child's legal identity. The condition of your court-mandated therapy was not just to attend classes, it was to demonstrate that you could operate as an independent, protective parent." The judge leaned forward. "You co-signed a property deed with the subject of a permanent restraining order. You listed her as the primary caregiver for a child she is legally forbidden from contacting. You have demonstrated zero insight into the core issue of this case." The judge picked up his gavel. "The petition for unsupervised and out-of-state visitation is denied. Parental rights remain restricted to supervised visitation within this county, under court monitoring, with zero contact permitted involving the co-owner of your residence." Mark's face completely drained of color. He looked at his lawyer, then looked back at the judge, realizing that his 2-year plan to appease his mother had permanently shattered his remaining legal leverage. As we walked out of the courthouse, Mark caught up to me in the lobby. For the first time in years, he didn't look angry or defensive. He just looked completely defeated. "She told me this would work," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "She said if I did the classes and got the house, the judge wouldn't be able to say no." I stopped and looked at him. "Mark," I said gently, "that's the problem. You are still listening to her tell you how to live your life. You did all that work for her, not for Maya." He didn't have a response. He just stood there as the doors opened, and I walked out into the sunlight. That was the moment the book finally closed. Not when the first divorce papers were signed, not when the first police report was filed, but when the legal system permanently drew the line that Mark refused to draw himself. Maya is thriving today. She is growing up knowing she is safe, loved, and protected by a mother who was willing to fight through every legal battle, every threat, and every manipulation to keep her world secure. Sometimes, keeping your peace requires more than just walking away, it requires holding the line no matter how many times toxic people try to break it down. If you were in my shoes, would you have given him a second chance after he completed those classes, or was listing his mother the ultimate deal-breaker? Drop your verdict down in the comments, I want to hear your thoughts. Thank you for following this entire story. Don't forget to like and subscribe for daily posts, and I'll see you in the next one. 3 years had passed since that final courtroom confrontation. Maya was 6.5 years old, a bright, confident little girl getting ready to enter first grade. She knew about her father in the simple, age-appropriate way we had agreed on, that he lived far away and wasn't able to take care of her, but that she was safe and surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. I had completely moved on with my life. I was running a successful remote consulting business, enjoying quiet weekends with my family, and for 3 solid years, the silence from Mark and Brenda had been absolute. Until one evening, an email arrived in my inbox. The subject line was simply, "I'm sorry." Asterisk. I sat at my desk for a long time staring at the screen before opening it. The email wasn't from a lawyer, and it wasn't a legal notice. It was a personal email from Mark. He wrote that Brenda had passed away peacefully 2 weeks prior after a brief illness. He explained that during her final months, when her health began failing, the illusion of control she had maintained over his entire life finally broke apart. Without her constantly driving the narrative, directing his legal battles, and dictating his choices, Mark was left standing alone in an empty house, realizing the true cost of everything he had sacrificed. He wrote, "I am not writing this to ask for custody. I am not writing this to drag you back to court. I am writing this because I finally see what I did. I allowed my mother to destroy my marriage, steal my daughter's early years, and treat you with unbelievable cruelty while you were recovering from childbirth. You were right at the courthouse all those years ago. I did everything for her, never for Maya, and never for you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that the fight is over." Asterisk. I sat at my computer reading those words over and over. For years, I had prepared myself for every possible legal attack, every manipulation, and every court appearance. I had built an impenetrable wall around my daughter and myself. But I had never prepared for an actual admission of guilt. I didn't cry, and I didn't feel a sudden rush of warmth toward him. What I felt was a profound, quiet sense of closure. The validation didn't change the years of trauma, the 3 a.m. escape in the freezing air, or the stress of court hearings, but it confirmed that I wasn't crazy. I had been fighting a real battle against real delusion, and standing my ground had been the only right choice. I took a few days to process it before I replied. I kept my email short, calm, and firm. "Thank you for acknowledging the truth. I am sorry for your loss. Forgiveness is a long process, but I hold no hatred toward you. Maya is safe, happy, and thriving. If you truly wish to be a positive presence in her life one day, it will start with patience, time, and absolute honesty, under proper professional guidance when she is ready." Asterisk. Today, Maya is thriving in school, laughing, painting, and living a peaceful childhood completely free from toxic family drama. Looking back across this entire journey, from that terrified night in the kitchen holding an altered birth certificate, to building a completely independent life from scratch, I realize the ultimate lesson of this story. When people show you they do not respect your core reality, you cannot argue them into changing. You cannot fix people who are determined to consume you. The greatest power you have is the courage to pack your bags, walk out into the dark, and write your own story on your own terms. That brings us to the very end of this journey. If you were in my shoes, would you ever consider allowing a supervised relationship in the future after a sincere apology like that, or would the past be a permanent closed door? Drop your final verdicts in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you so much for sticking through this entire journey with me. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for daily stories every single day, and I'll see you in the next confession.